Selamat malam, Pat.
Selamat malam, Pak Anton.
Apa kabar?
Senang ketemu dengan Anda sekali lagi.
Ya, saya juga senang
Lewat
sekali
Zoom.
ketemu ya.
Kabar baik, terima kasih.
Yeah. I've been knowing you, Pat, more than 25 years. I remember I and Bella, folding the Inside Indonesia at the Fitzroy church. Remember that? More than 25 years ago.
Yes, I do.
So what I remember in my eyes at the moment, Pat Walsh is more a priest. That's what in my mind now, and an activist, a writer, a poet, So how do you see yourself on those titles? I mean, you're more a writer, an activist, a priest. What could you tell us, what story behind all of this?
Well, let me say first that the room I'm sitting in was the Inside Indonesia office for its first iteration for quite a few years.
Right.
So it's nice that we're talking about Inside Indonesia to begin with. And
yes,
I'm in the very place where it was administered from, front room of my house.
Okay.
Who am I? Well, look, let me go to, I do write and I love writing, but I'm sort of hesitant to describe myself as a writer or a poet. I'm happy to be identified as a human rights advocate. So let me just try and explain that. Most people say, when they ask me what I do and I say human rights, they say, oh, so you're a lawyer. And I say, no, I'm not really. I'm just another person like you. But I think I picked up human rights in my sort of DNA, my Irish DNA.
Right.
Then it was sort of developed and shaped by my mother and then my Catholic education. So it sort of comes fairly naturally to me. Because, both my mum, my dad too, but particularly my mum and my Catholic educators basically stress two principles: that you love other people and you sort of do this because actually they're made in the image of God. So to say, Anton Alimin is in the image of God is a pretty big thing. Same for Pat Walsh. But that's the idea. And it means that any sort of violence or human rights violation perpetrated against an image of God is almost by definition sacrilege, or if you like, to really take it to its logical extreme, a sort of a sin, because it's a violation not of just an individual or the rule of law in international legal terms. It's a violation of, it offends, the divinity. It's got that sort of dimension to it. So I have a very simple, basic concept of human rights. I think there's only one human right, and that's the right to be as fully human as you can be. And the architecture and all the treaties and conventions and stuff that lawyers have to learn and people in Amnesty International have to know if they're going to be really good advocates, all that is just scaffolding and extension of that basic idea that the fundamental human right is the right to be human. And to be human, you have to be free. To be creative, you have to have freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom to elect your leaders, to hold them accountable, all that sort of stuff. So it all flows from that simple idea. So you don't have to be an expert in international law to be a human rights advocate in lots of ways. So, it boils down to respect, basically, and treating other people, even kids in a way, as adults You have a certain, extra respect for them and from that point of view. So, but the right side of it says that the state has an obligation to respect the holder, the person who has the right, the person who wants to be fully human. So that is the big extra dimension that gets added by the UN since 1945 in the Second World War, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN was set up. It delimits the power of the state. It says, thou shalt not interfere with the freedoms, the opportunities, the rights, etc., that belong to everybody, regardless of sex, of religion, of political persuasion, whatever. And that's why people like, if I may say so, Vladimir Putin and maybe in Indonesian terms, Suharto, don't like the idea of human rights very much because it actually curtails their power. So that's the whole idea. Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah. But then I was sort of given the opportunity, the blessing in lots of ways of being able to exercise that commitment, those tenets in relation to East Timor and Indonesia.
Right. Okay. I can see, I mean, the force behind being an activist, by being Irish, Catholic upbringing, and also, I mean, the justice has to be done. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's really the force behind why you're doing all of this. But inside Indonesia, why it has to be, actually in Africa also, human right abuse, why Indonesia?
Why Indonesia?
In East Timor, how it started first, and then that you involved in this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think sort of procedurally, I'd explain it this way. I studied a rather esoteric subject called Oriental Civilization at the Australian National University in Canberra back in the early 60s. And then I was sent teaching by my religious order. And after 1 year, the principal of the school said, listen, we need to get with it and teach an Asian language. And Walshy, we're going to send you off to Monash over the summer, the long break at the end of my first year of teaching. I taught 67. Then over the summer of 67, 68, I did a 6 weeks cursus kilat at Monash University. So I like to say, in some ways, I'm a love child of Suharto.
Right.
Because Australian bankers and universities all sort of rushed to, they all saw, Suharto opened the doors of Indonesia to the West, investment and trade and all that. And everybody said, well, we've got to start learning some Bahasa. So this course was set up at Monash and I was enrolled and I did the course. I had to go, I was teaching in Hamilton, Western Victoria, right over near the South Australian border. I don't think I'd met an Indonesian at that point. I certainly didn't know any Bahasa. Right. And there was no Indonesians for several hundred miles of Hamilton and no Indonesian kids in the school or anything like that. But there was one Dutch lady whose name was Tyson, who had a boy in school and she knew how to cook nasi goreng and we used to go there from time to time and she'd cook an Indonesian meal for us. So that was the only authentic touch we had, but I've jumped ahead. I did this course at Monash and guess who was teaching me? Ramin Hadibrato.
Right.
He died, I think, quite recently.
Last Sunday, actually.
Last Sunday.
Yeah.
So I read that with a tear in my eye because that was the only contact I had with him. I actually, by some miracle, topped the class. And then the Forelanders Trust who endowed this course, who paid for it, paid the Monash lecturers, etc.
Right.
They gave me a sort of a scholarship to travel to Indonesia the next summer break. So I taught it sort of.
Yes, yes.
1968. Then the end of 1968, I made my first ever visit to Indonesia. So, but this is very soon after Suharto had taken over, and the whole
Yes.
place was pretty tense, and I had trouble finding accommodation in various places. I can talk about all that, but that's, so it was an insight into not just Indonesian culture and the befriending a whole lot of people, and of course, mainly
Yes.
to get some photos that I could use as teaching resources and you know, improve my pronunciation and act with a little bit more authority in the classroom back in Hamilton. It was all about that. But it also
Right.
gave me the beginnings of an insight into the Orde Baru. And that has
Right.
stayed with me then the long term.
Yes.
But let me just say a word about the Forelanders Trust. The guy who set it up was Martin Clemens. He's now dead at 94, 2009 he died. He was very wealthy. He lived in a beautiful Georgian house in Turak.
Right.
And at the end of the course, he invited us all back there to sort of have a party. And because I'd done well in the course, I was asked to sort of do the thank you speech in Bahasa Indonesia.
Very good, Pat. Very good.
I was, you know, right out of my depth. I knew I'd never been in Turak before, let alone a big Georgian mansion.
Right.
And this guy was born in Scotland, a former British colonial officer, had married into big money from Queensland grazing family.
Right.
And that was used to endow the course. But he was a near mythical figure because he was posted to the Solomon Islands before the Second World War. And then after all his colleagues left because the Japanese were coming, he stayed and he reported on Japanese movements to the Allied troops. And he was even involved in saving John F. Kennedy. So this guy was an extraordinarily sort of living legend, and he had this great interest in, you know, the region and peoples around the region, and he much loved in the Solomon Islands because he stuck with them. So he was a good model for me as well. Yeah.
So you left toward Indonesia. It's very 67, 68, the year he was, you know, officially by MPR, you know, as a second, you know, Indonesian president. 68, you went to Indonesia. I think this, you know, very interesting era.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Right.
I mean, I was a complete novice, politically and in other ways.
Right.
But I, you know, I was all ears and all eyes, and I took in as much as I could.
Right.
And one of the loveliest, well, I stayed in Jakarta, then I went to Bandung. I had trouble, I wanted to stay with the family there. I didn't want to sort of live in institutions and hang around my religious order. I wanted to sort of associate with ordinary Indonesians, but people were very wary about having, you know, an orang asing, particularly an Australian, in their home in case the neighbours or somebody reported them. You know, I got those sort of insights. I remember going to Jogja, to Surabaya, a place called Purwokerto. And I remember going into a rice field in Purwokerto, and I just wanted to sort of have a look at it. And a farmer came up to me and he said very suspiciously in a quiet voice, "Cari apa? What are you looking for?" And I've always thought he thought I was a journalist or some sort of researcher, and he was a bit worried about me being there for, you know, who knows what reasons. But let me just say, in Bandung, I got an object that has been very dear and precious to me ever since. I'll just show you.
Right.
It's this. Can you see that?
Yes. The
It's a
penjual jamu, is it?
jamu lady.
That's right.
Made by a tapol in the old Dutch prison in Bandung.
Right.
Still got the sticker on the bottom. Sold to me for 2,750 rupiah. Virtually nothing.
How much again? Say it again.
It is beautiful. 2,750 rupiah.
Gee.
And it is a beautiful piece of work. And it made me realize that it just sensitized me to the impact, if you like, of
Yes.
the pogroms, of the purges, of the PKI, etc., conducted
Yes.
by the Indonesian military in Suharto. And I thought the people in these periods, they're not common criminals, they're very gifted people, and Indonesia is sort of deleting or denying itself the service, the creativity, the contribution of all these quite brilliant people, represented
Yes.
in part by this beautiful piece of work in papier-mâché.
So have you tested in a jamu? Have you tried
Oh
yourself?
yeah, I have. Oh yes,
Right.
I have. Yeah, 2014 when I actually lived in Jakarta for 12 months.
Right.
When I wrote Berawan dengan Kesempatan Nasi Goreng,
It's good.
my book, with a chance of fried rice. Yeah, Jamu lady used to do the rounds near Kompas where I
Right.
was working, near
Right.
KPG, Gramedia, where I was working
Yes.
there. And,
Yes.
yeah, so I tried a bit.
Yes. Go back. I mean, I remember when I landed in Australia, in Sydney in 1980, and 2 months later I went to Lismore. I was interviewed by Radio Lismore, and asked me about Indonesian invasion, inverted commas, to East Timor. I defended, and I said, because Indonesia's fear of communism, because the 6 months after Saigon fell to the communists. So Indonesia went in on the 8th of December 1975, but Gerald Ford and Kissinger were in Jakarta the day before. Now, how do you explain that? I mean, the way I look at now, the Indonesian did the dirty job, but the West got the glory. One day after Kissinger, Gerald Ford in Jakarta. Now, how do you explain that? That I mean, this East Timor, the 75 invasion to East Timor by the Indonesian.
Well, I think the sort of simple, though not superficial answer is basically the Cold War and the balance of power that shifted dramatically after the fall of Vietnam and America's humiliation and defeat and ignominious retreat. And that had a massive impact in Indonesia, and we know what the response was there. And for that reason, Suharto was sort of welcomed by Australia and the West generally. And then on the other hand, well, to put it a bit simply, Fretilin, the Revolutionary Party for Independent East Timor, scared paranoid people like Suharto.
Yes.
He interpreted it as, well, a counterpoint to Indonesia's model of government, which, very different to his way of doing things, that what Fretilin wanted to do. They wanted to run a democracy and a different style of society to the one that Suharto created and was running. So it was a threat in that sense, but it was particularly a threat, imagined or otherwise, basically imagined that it would be a source of revolutionary export to, somewhat fragile Indonesia. I mean, remembering this is only 1975. This is only sort of 10 years after Suharto, not long after Indonesia got its own independence. And, you know, there were threats to balkanize Indonesia, if you like, from West Irian, from Maluku, etc., etc. And then there are all the tensions within Indonesia, within Java, if you like.
Yes.
So anything that looked like it might create, you know, that might destabilize or break up Indonesia was taboo, not just for Suharto, but in the West generally. And when Ford and Kissinger arrived and had the conversation, and the text of their conversations been reported everywhere, Suharto said, basically, is it okay if I take over Timor? And Ford said, yes, we understand.
Yes. Interestingly enough, I mean, in the Hamish MacDonald in Suharto's Indonesia, among the Indonesian leaders at the time, Suharto was reluctant to do it, but being pushed to do it, to go ahead. You know what I mean? Saigon fell in the 30th of April. The Indonesian went in the 8th of December, 76 months later.
Yeah.
It's sad. I mean, if you look at, I mean, the hypocrisy behind the whole this, you know, we discovered that, you know, years later.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I wouldn't say that the West sort of was the cat that got the milk, as you put it, or, you know, came away with all the glory. I mean, it covered itself with shame, because this was clearly a violation. It was condemned by the UN.
Yeah.
The UN said, Indonesia, withdraw. But Indonesia refused, you know, like Putin's doing in Ukraine, sort of thing.
Yes.
And it just went on. And there were not even, Indonesia wasn't even told, look, you'll be expelled from the UN, or there weren't even any sanctions. It was sort of kid glove stuff from the member states of the UN all the way through, and Australia in particular backed Indonesia. I mean, we provided military aid. I'm not saying it was necessarily used in East Timor, but it's a pretty clear endorsement of a military and a society to provide it with weaponry. I mean, you know, again, looking at Ukraine and the support for Zelensky and all the rest of it from the West on the other side, you know, that sort of thing. But I think, I mean, it should have been a walkover for Indonesia.
Yes.
It should have been a walk in the park. If you think of it as a sort of a game of soccer, Indonesia had the best players. You know, it had Messi and Rolando and Sam Kerr and Harry Kewell, to use a couple of Aussie names. Timor was sort of C-grade suburban team. You know, didn't even have proper boots and uniforms to wear, all that sort of thing. It should have been a total walkover, but you know, we witnessed there something again very similar to what's happening in Ukraine, that they sort of had enough sense of their own rights and their own sort of identity, which intensified as the war went on, to resist. And at one point, of course, they were nearly annihilated by the end of 1970s. They were close to total annihilation. Then it was rebuilt, and they changed their strategy and their ideology and everything very dramatically, and it worked. Worked in their favor.
Seems to me we must have them at the time. It's nearly up. And that's the last question before you recite poetry. What about the Portuguese? What's fault they did? I mean, the East Timor under the Portuguese more than 300 years, and 75 civil war. What did they do? Try to stop the civil war? Did anything?
Let me just say, to finish my soccer analogy,
right,
that Indonesia lost the game for two reasons. It didn't follow the rules. You know, in soccer, you've got offside and corner kicks and boundary throw-ins. Indonesia ignored the rules. That's what got it into so much trouble with the UN and so on. And number two, it scored a whole lot of own goals, particularly through human rights violations, which were alienating. And then, of course, were used by activists and others to say, you know, there's got to be accountability, there's got to be justice. This is not right. You know, in simple terms, this is wrong, and so on. So I think, you know, that's roughly it. Portugal, well, it's a big issue, but it continued to be recognised by the UN and later in the peace by Indonesia as the ongoing administering power, because there had been no proper decolonisation. They wanted to offload Timor in 1974, 75, in the famous flower revolution in Portugal. The decision was made to divest Portugal of its anachronistic empire in Africa, in Asia, and particularly East Timor. But then, you know, the developments that we spoke of with Indonesia occurred, and the Cold War factor kicked in, and it didn't work out that way. But right through that period, in technical legal terms, Portugal had responsibility for East Timor. And after it got its act together, it actually became an advocate for its benighted, neglected, ignored colony that it should have done something about way back in 1960, when the UN said, Portugal, you've got to educate these people, develop them so they can make a proper, informed, free act of free choice, if you like, decision about their future. Portugal never did that. Yeah. And it still disadvantages East Timor at this point. Yeah.
All right, but I think we should next time we have to do the two episodes. This is episode 1. Next one will be, and I think it will be interesting, you know, to talk about the role of the Portuguese, you know, during the Civil War. Now, I'd like you to recite, you know, poetry, something, or you can sing if you like. You can play music if in there.
No, next time I think we should talk about your question about where are things going in the short, in the medium and long term.
Yeah.
How do I see the next 5 or 10 years?
All right.
Australia-Indonesia relations, East Timor-Indonesia relations. I'd like to explore that a little bit and see what you think as well. My poem is in Bahasa.
Right.
I'm going to read in Bahasa. With I ask for forgiveness before I start. It's called The Cleansing of the Temple, Pembersihan Pura. Right. And it's based on a visit I made to Bali in 2009, and I was going past the temple in Bali, and I saw Balinese priest sweeping, and I thought, that is so Indonesian. You know, I've been in many places in Indonesia where the thing that woke me up in the morning was the pembantu, or the housekeeper, sweeping, you know, scraping the soil outside.
All right.
So I've sort of played with that idea, but I also say the poem also hints at the cleansing of the temple in the gospel,
right,
where Jesus didn't just cleanse it of material dirt, he cleansed it of human dirt in the form of excess commercialization. And there's a bit of a cheeky reference in there to maybe that is needed in over-commercialized, over-exploited Bali.
Okay, silakan, Pat.
It's in this book.
Right, okay.
Pembersihan Pura. Melirik ke kanan, melewati ambang pintu, sebuah adegan abadi menampilkan diri bagai sebuah lukisan. Pedanda Bali membersihkan bumi janggut bergantung di suru, di bawah mata yang dalam, kepala terbungkus handuk polos, jubah panjang, putih, dan sederhana, merunduk, tidak dalam kegemaran seperti Imam Injil, melainkan setiap gerakan lambat, sebuah tindakan pengabdian yang dipersembahkan setiap hari di sudut pura global ini untuk menenangkan dan membebaskannya dari kejahatan demi yang terburu-buru lewat tak menyadari pelayanan komisnya yang abadi.
Congratulations, Pat. The language still there.
Okay,
Still
it's
there.
understandable.
Yes.
Good,
All right,
Anton.
Pat. I think we should. I mean, continue with the second episode, that's for sure. Then we're
Okay.
going to discuss because the topics is it's too big in a very
Yeah.
short time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Terima kasih banyak dan Pat. Selamat malam dan sampai jumpa lagi.
Kembali, tidak apa-apa. Okay.